If you were to meet Donald Trump for 10 minutes, what would you say?
Well, if I were to meet with Donald Trump for 10 minutes, I would share with him the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world. Um, I would let the Prophet speak for himself. I mean, who speaks for Islam? Who better to speak for Islam than the Prophet himself? And I would invite him to read these covenants, these treaties, these charters of rights and protection that he granted to the monks from St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, to the monastery of St. Macarius in Egypt, to the monastery of St. George al-Humayda in Syria, the covenants that he made with the Armenian Christians of Jerusalem, with the Assyrian Christians, with the Christians of Persia, and also the covenants that he made with the Jews of Ayla or Makna, as well as the constitution of Medina. So by reading the words of the prophet, the messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, he will see that the actions of groups like ISIS and Boko Haram and so on are not representative. They do not represent Islam in any way, shape, or form. And actually, these groups are systematically violating the teachings of Islam. Consequently, they have no connection whatsoever to the Muslim faith and to the Islamic faith. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, granted Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians freedom of religion, freedom of religious practice. He protected their modest monasteries and their churches. And he prohibited Muslims from overtaxing them. He gave tax exemptions to clerics of the Christian faith, of the Jewish faith, and so on. And he commanded Muslims not to destroy their religious buildings. On the contrary, to help fix them in order to make sure that they would remain faithful and that they would remain allies, allies of the Prophet and the Muslim state. So yes, I would point Donald Trump to the words of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him.
We tend to react to people like Donald Trump. What is the best way to engage positively with someone that has a similar mindset?
How do we engage with people like Trump? Well, I think we have to try to educate these people, if possible. I mean, through our words, but also through our actions. In 2015, there were anti-Muslim rallies organized all over the country, uh, organized by Islamophobes and so on, and where they encouraged people, bikers and so on, to come with their weapons in hand and their guns drawn to try to intimidate Muslims. And they targeted mosques throughout the country. Now, Muslims could have reacted with threats of violence, to threats of violence with threats of violence of their own, but they didn't. On the contrary, they went out and they greeted these people and they introduced themselves and they offered them coffee and they offered them tea and they invited them into their mosques and they gave them tours and they offered them snacks and so on. And these people realized that Muslims are professionals, they're engineers, they're professors, they're entrepreneurs, they're business people, they're medical doctors, they're ordinary people, people who contribute to this country, people with strong traditional family values. And they realized that indeed they had a great deal in common with these people, that these people were not these caricatures that they see on television, these bearded madmen with their knives and so on, committing all sorts of atrocities. And so they realized by having contact with their Muslim neighbors that, Islam is one thing and Muslims are one thing, and these Takfiri Wahhabi terrorists are something entirely different.
What practical things can we do to promote a positive image of Islam?
Well, in Islam, we believe in the golden rule. I mean, this is something that was taught by all of the prophets and the messengers of God. It's something that we find in all religious traditions. There's an equivalent in Judaism, of course, in Christianity, in Islam, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, and so on. So this is a universal value. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. And so in Islam and in other religious traditions, your neighbor has a right. Uh, and in Islam, the neighbor is not defined as being necessarily a Muslim. Okay, your neighbor is your neighbor, and your neighbor has rights upon you. And so, as Muslims, we need to reach out to our neighbors. We shouldn't isolate ourselves. We should have contact with people. We should open up our mosques and invite them and let them interact with Muslims, get to know Muslims, and see what they're really like. Um, and we also have to teach Islam through practice. Like, for example, unfortunately, there have been many cases in which churches have been burned to the ground in the United States. One case in particular was an African American church. And who was behind efforts to raise funds in order to rebuild that mosque? It was a Muslim. In Canada, a similar event took place where a church was destroyed or vandalized or subject to arson. And again, it was the local mosque and the local Muslims who got together in order to help to rebuild this church. And so what we find is that these Muslims are putting into practice the teachings of the Prophet that are contained in these covenants, his lists of commands on how we are to treat non-Muslims, right? Non-Muslims who live, in a predominantly Muslim country or, our non-Muslim neighbors. So definitely teaching Islam through action, being engaged with the community, helping the community. For example, if you operate a food bank, or a soup kitchen for homeless people. I know one sister who has a homeless shelter. So if they see Muslims contributing to society, providing all kinds of social services, and someone comes up to them and says, "Oh, Muslims, they're all a bunch of terrorists and everything," those people who have experiential knowledge of Muslims will say, those brothers from down the block, no, they're not at all like that Bin Laden or Baghdadi guy. And so I think this is one of the ways that we can show to these people that we're truly and genuinely human.